I want to welcome to the program Pro Publica reporters J. David McSwane and Ryan Gabrielson. They have written a piece in Pro Publica, a Christian health nonprofit saddled thousands with debt as it built a family empire, including a pot farm, a bank, and an airline. That is quite a title for a piece. Guys, thanks so much for joining us. David, let's start with you. Can you just explain, because I've seen ads for these in the past many times and have wondered, like, what is going on here? These, I don't even know what they're called necessarily. These Christian, like this one, you did a story about Liberty Health Share, but it is a sharing ministry or a sort of a Christian health sort of insurance. Like what are these things called?
Well, that's pretty close. So if you saw ads, you knew more than I did before Ryan called me to talk about this thing that he was looking at. So healthcare sharing ministries are.
I listen to a lot of right-wing radio, I gotta say. So
okay.
That's why I.
Yeah. I don't have time for that. But healthcare sharing ministries are essentially these nonprofits that are unregulated that look and act like insurance. So instead of paying like a premium each month to a corporation for insurance, you give money to this nonprofit and you expect that if you break your leg or you get sick, those bills will be paid. And it's really sort of taken from a tradition in the Mennonite and Amish communities of, people who didn't really want to be involved in traditional insurance, and they just, agreed we're all Christians, we'll take care of each other. And, we found sort of starting really ramping up in the 80s, this particular family in Canton, Ohio had found a way to commoditize it.
But Ryan, there are you mentioned a couple other examples in the piece of these type of things that also had some problems. Like what theoretically was the business model for this? Like, we're going to get 100 members and they're all going to give us $100. And then if somebody gets cancer, we're going to come up with like $1 million to provide. Like, how does that work? How is it theoretically supposed to work?
Well, I mean, as a business, in their original concept, it didn't work. It worked as a small group of people, sort of, largely healthy people chipping in, within a church community. On that scale, generally, it could work. On a large scale, it's insurance, but they, the main sort of motivating thing for people who are joining these is they're trying to stay outside of sort of the corporate world, which they don't trust, the government regulated world that they don't necessarily trust. They're trying to stay within a freer, a much cheaper. That's one of the big selling things, is that they're paying sometimes a fraction of what they'd pay in premiums each month. With the idea that it is, I'm a largely healthy person, I shouldn't have to pay very much, and I'm giving to a charity that isn't just giving money to shareholders, and the money is there just in case, in the unlikely event that I get sick or break something. Well, then this community of like-minded people will all take care of me because we're all Christians here, and even those who are not Christian sometimes are sort of reassured by the idea, well, this is being run, this is a Christian institution, they're not going to, scam anybody. But as is the case with most sort of industries that are unregulated, problems tend to pop up.
Yeah, it seems like it. There was, this story centers around a guy named Dan Beers, but it starts, it seems, with Bruce Hawthorne, who is his uncle. David, tell us about who Bruce Hawthorne was.
So this is a fascinating character, a evangelical preacher in the 60s who, he sold his sermons in truck stops, via tape, and, sort of built a little bit of a following. He started what's called the Barberton Rescue Mission, which was really aimed at helping men deal with alcoholism, and was just running that charity, for a few years when he experienced a tragedy where, he was driving his family to Michigan. They were broadsided by a truck, and he lost his wife and a child, and several kids were injured. He shared that news in a newsletter that, sort of went across the country. And the response was people sent money, checks and cash to help him pay his bills. And it sort of dawned on him that, maybe I could scale this and turn this into something. I could be an intermediary, and we could have sort of a national thing. And so was born HealthShares as we know them today. And it was a fascinating thing, because insurance, you have to deal with state regulations. You have to do state to state. Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, United Healthcare, they can't just sell the same thing to everybody across the nation. But if you're a health share, you can. So there's tremendous opportunity to bring in a lot of money. And it operated this way for a while. And it was pretty small. No one really cared. State regulators started to notice, and they really got ahead and hired a lawyer and started lobbying and started to change state laws, actually, to protect themselves. And it was really in the mid 90s when his nephew, Dan Beers, who you mentioned, joins the operation, and they start to figure out how to take money out of the nonprofit and move it into for-profit operations that they controlled, to amass great wealth. And we found, a similar blueprint was used in Liberty HealthShare, a couple of decades later.
Yeah. So, Ryan, tell us about how Dan Beers comes in and does that. Like, or I guess maybe give us first a little bit of a sort of a 101 course on like what a nonprofit can and cannot do generally. I mean, that's the thing, is that, like, people don't think that you can make money working for a nonprofit, but you can. It's just that the entity can't make money, right?
Well, even the entity can. So at the end of the year, lots of nonprofits come out with more money at the end of the year than they started the year with. That's technically a form of profit, but what you can do with that money is supposed to be regulated. And there's also rules on how much you can pay executives. So you're not supposed to be able to use it to just, enrich yourself. Along the same lines are rules about self-dealing, where you can't take the charity's money and just give it to a business that you own. Well, at least
so in other words, I can't set up a nonprofit, take donations, and say, like, you know what, we just one of the things that we like at this nonprofit is podcast subscriptions, and so we bought the 10,000 podcast subscriptions to the Majority Report. That's just what we did with the nonprofit. That's part of our mission.
You could do that.
You could potentially do that if you can make the argument that it is within the public service mission of the charity or the nonprofit. You can. I once heard someone say you could club baby seals and call it charity, and there's a lot of evidence that I don't know if that's actually the case, but you can fit a lot of things within a broad enough public service.
Wow.
So that is the.
Now I'm distracted.
Well, maybe you've got something to do right after this podcast ends. So there's rules, but some of it is a matter of interpretation. Some of it is a matter of just whether or not even the IRS chooses to investigate and enforce those rules. Now, in the case of the Christian Brotherhood newsletter, which was the first sharing ministry that Bruce Hawthorne set up, he made it a family business, essentially, which is not uncommon. Small businesses hire relatives. His small charity hired a lot of relatives. In the early 90s, his nephew, Dan Beers, came on board and moved into something called bill repricing. So in any insurance function, you've got to try to lower the cost of the care. Dan was ostensibly, at least, going to renegotiate all these bills to reduce the price. In the mid 90s, he formed a for-profit business that took over the function that he had supposedly been doing inside the Brotherhood newsletter, and had his for-profit do it for the sharing ministry, and was supposed to be paid just as, for all the savings that they were generating, a 15% essentially. But within a short period of time, he's auto deducting $55,000 a week to his private business from the sharing ministry. And the sharing
So they
ministry
outsource the function of negotiations with hospitals to an enterprise he sets up, and it turns out not to save money, but to actually cost exponentially more to his benefit.
and to push the sharing ministry to the brink of failure because they were running short on money to actually pay people's bills.
Okay, and so and then what happens? He finds he can get away with that, and it just becomes a series of of ways of evacuating money from this nonprofit. It feels like.
Yes, so there was a huge amount of money flowing out, and it was also Bruce Hawthorne stuff really was buying houses and assembling a huge estate in north of Canton. For friends and family. Eventually, some of the members of the board of his original charity, the Barberton Rescue Mission, are becoming concerned and file a complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's office and asking them to conduct a charity investigation, which launches in around 1998 and takes 2 years, but it was a pretty rigorous investigation and finds essentially a cesspool of fraud and what they argue constitutes racketeering. I mean, organized criminal activity. Money laundering is
David,
one of the terms they use.
Yeah, walk us through that a little bit. And we should say, right, these board of directors did not have access to the books, I guess. So it wasn't sort of obvious like where all this money was going to them.
Yeah, in the case of the Christian Brotherhood newsletter, it was a much smaller operation than Liberty HealthCare, but as Ryan said, there was this side business that Dan Beers had set up that ostensibly was supposed to get about 15% of all the cost savings, but there was really no correlation between the work done and the money being pulled out of the nonprofit into the corporation. And once that money leaves a nonprofit and is in the hands of a for-profit, there's really no public insight into what happens to that money. So the AG's contention was that money's now been washed and it's been used to buy things like a jet and a family compound and 3 Honda Goldwing motorcycles, I believe, and other things. And what we found was when we looked at Liberty HealthCare, which is very recent, that there were similar things going on in terms of money leaving the nonprofit going into 2 family-controlled businesses, and then that money being diffused across dozens of shell companies and eventually ending up in, I think we got it in the headline, a pot farm and an airline and a bank and tons of other stuff. So they kind of figured out that this is something that they can get away with even after the AG investigation.
Yeah, well, what happened with that AG investigation? And this is back now. We're at 2000 or so, right? What came of that AG investigation? They find a cesspool. What did they do?
Well, they referred under Ohio state law. In some states, the Attorney General's office would just file criminal charges. In Ohio, there's law and practice that the AG does not file directly in a county. The county prosecutor has to do it. So they did that. They recommended more than 60 charges, criminal charges against Dan Beers in particular for fraud, theft, money laundering, an array of crimes. The local county prosecutors took up the case, and they had a little task force that was investigating. And for reasons that are not 100% clear, but partially, the sitting prosecutor who was interested in the case lost re-election. There was turnover in the staff. They lost the thread, essentially. The criminal case doesn't go anywhere, but the Attorney General's office proceeds and files a civil suit representing essentially the charity itself and sues these individuals and accusing them of self-enrichment and fraud. And that case goes to trial. And in 2004, a jury held Hawthorne and Beers liable and found that they had committed fraud and fined Dan Beers $9.6 million that he was supposed to repay the charity.
Wasn't it Hawthorne that had to repay the charity and Beers?
Hawthorne
Okay.
had less. Yeah, they in total the two combined had $14 million in damages.
So, David, I know that Hawthorne escaped having to pay that by expiring, as it were. But what about Beers? Like, how did Beers end up not having to pay that, or has he?
He's paid a little bit very recently, but is evaded. He's a master at running away from liens. We found dozens of tax liens. People had sued him for various allegations of fraud. And, in this judgment, after it happened, he told the local newspaper, we didn't, it doesn't mean we did anything wrong. So he kind of signaled that he didn't really take it seriously. And he continued to, be involved in like high stakes poker tournaments and so forth. I mean, you can run away from a civil judgment for quite some time. And it wasn't until it was obvious that he had income somehow related to Liberty Health Share that he negotiated paying just a fraction of that settlement in installments with the Ohio Attorney General. And I believe, Ryan, correct me, I believe he missed the last payment.
He hasn't made the most recent payment that was due, so it is unclear the status of whether his $9-something million in fines with interest is actually $20 million something now, but he struck a deal to pay $1 million, and he's supposed to have made another $200-something thousand payment several months ago, and it hasn't happened yet, at least.
I mean, how does this guy get away with it? I mean, is it because presumably, right, there's a lot of people out there who paid money into this charity, who joined the club or whatever it is, got a membership, got sick, did not get paid. Is it that when you do something nationally like this, as opposed to like it's in one community, there's far less sort of like political stakes involved for a specific attorney general to bring a charge against you and pursue it, or what is it? Is it that like it's so diffuse? If this is all happening in one small community, there'd be a couple of reporters like you, theoretically, maybe at one time, maybe not so much, but maybe, who are going to pursue this in the community, and this is going to be the thing that you guys are doing. But because it's national, it's sort of diffuse. I mean, how does somebody get away with this?
Well, I mean, some of it just honestly is kind of gall. The ability to, I mean, in the case of
Gusto, like he's got a vibe. I love it.
Yeah. Well, so Dan Beers, after the Christian Brotherhood newsletter collapsed, he had several down years where he got busted on misdemeanor. Bouncing a $50 check to a grocery store. He says in the stories he tells about himself that he was homeless for a time.
What did he do with all this money?
Well, that's an open question of where the $20-something million that he moved, that went from the newsletter to his private business went. At some point, it did. It appears to have been gone. Anyhow, by the time that they're launching Liberty Health Share in 2013, 2014, sources are telling us that he was in the mix, he was in the meetings, but the people on the paperwork are his sister, Drudy Abel, and one of his best friends, Dale Bellis, who both had worked as executives at the Christian Brotherhood newsletter, but they're founding Liberty. When it comes time for them to set up the businesses that Liberty will be paying, very similar to the way the Christian Brotherhood newsletter paid Dan Beers' business, it's his sons and his sons' friends' names on those companies, not his. His name isn't on anything. And that one-step removal, they seem to believe, alleviates either the legal concern or at least the appearance of impropriety.
Wow. It is a crazy story. And I mean, it's fascinating because I have been like hearing about these sort of shares. Did you guys ever come across one that works, that actually like is doing what it's supposed to do?
We've got a story coming out next week that talks a little more broadly about the industry, and we quote a couple people who, their contention is that these can work, and there are good actors, and that the Beers family has really, members of that family have taken advantage of this space, and it's pretty small, and since Congress has done away with the individual mandate, it said we all must have insurance.
Right.
Their appeal is really fading away. So I don't know how much longer they can really sustain market wise. But we didn't drill all the way down on all the health shares, but they all exist in this space where the IRS isn't very good at policing nonprofits. Insurance regulators don't look at them. They operate across state lines. It's really just a strange no man's land in terms of regulation. So you can get away with a lot.
Wow. David McSwane, Ryan Gabrielson, thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to the piece. It is, and we'll keep an eye out for this next one. A bit of a cautionary tale, maybe. I'm not sure how many of our listeners are doing this, but that's a little bit of a cautionary tale, and it's something to look out for when you're listening to Mark Levin or one of those other shows. You'll hear it advertised occasionally. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.